Hello and welcome back to Let's Learn Fabric. Welcome back, fabricators. We are going to build some more fabric-related elements. Today, we're going to jump in and we're going to go pull one of our Excel files, actually a CSV file that we previously loaded into our lakehouse. We're going to grab that file and we're going to load it directly into a table back into the lakehouse, but we're going to do so using Dataflows Gen 2.
How exciting. This is probably what the most excited I've been to showcase something in a very long time. Mike, take it away.
Tommy and I were just talking about this on the beginning, just before we got started here on the training piece for this one. We were just trying to look through and figure out what's going on here. How is this going to change our workflows? And we were actually kind of having a heated debate around what is this going to do? How is this going to change what we're building in the future here? So we'll probably talk about this a bit more in the future. So first things first, we're going to log into PowerBI.com. I'm already logged in to my PowerBI.com workspace. If we go in here to our workspaces, you'll see that we have two workspaces available to us. We're going to use the Learn Fabric workspace. That's what we're going to do our work in. Clicking on the workspace, you'll see that we have our lakehouse. So our lakehouse has already been created right here. And we have two computes that are going along with this. We have the SQL endpoint, which is located right here. That's called the Great Lake, and it has this little house-looking item. And then we have a data set, which is basically a cube or a Power BI data model, the data set representing what's inside the Great Lake. Okay, that being said, we're now going to create our Dataflow Gen 2, and what we're going to do is we're going to go into our lakehouse. We've already uploaded a file. It lives in our lakehouse. We're going to go connect to that file, and then we're going to create a table inside the lakehouse. Now, Tommy and I were trying to figure this out. Like, you can do it, but why do you want to do this? Tommy, give me some more of the why here while I click on a couple more buttons.
So, man, Mike, you're opening a can of worms. So the biggest part here when we're doing this is it's our ability to store data in Fabric in the Lakehouse. Dataflow's an incredible ability to automate and take data from multiple sources. But again, focusing here, just the Lakehouse, the amount of transformations and the clean that we can do all with a single UI.
That's a great point. All right, so just be aware, when you're in Fabric, there are two versions of Dataflows you can use. You'll notice here in the bottom left-hand corner, I'm in the little Power BI icon, the bottom left. And the Power BI icon lets me know that I'm in the Power BI environment as it relates to how I'm building things. So if I click the New button in the upper left-hand corner, clicking on New will drop down a list. And you'll notice we have the word Dataflow. But be aware, this is the old Dataflow. This is the normal Dataflow we've been using that we like in Power BI Pro licenses and everything else. This is not Gen 2. Okay. What we have to do to change over to the Fabric environment is we click on the Power BI icon in the bottom left-hand corner. We then click on the Data Engineering button in the bottom left-hand corner. And by clicking on Data Engineering, we change the UI and what we can do. So clicking on Data Engineering, the whole UI changes. We can then click on the workspace again. So we have our workspace pinned on here on the left-hand side of the screen, Demo, Learn Fabric. Clicking on the workspace again, we go back to what we've already seen. It looks just the same. However, this time when I click the New button in the upper left-hand corner up here, you'll notice now we have a Dataflow Gen 2. This is the next version of Power BI Dataflows and the next generation of how this will operate. This is the one we're going to use to load data. So we're going to click on Dataflow Gen 2. And you'll notice right now, I didn't show you the screenshot of it, but you notice we had three objects inside our lake, or our workspace. We had a lakehouse, we had a SQL endpoint, and we had a data set. Now, I'm going to cancel out of this Dataflow just really quickly here because I want to show you what happens. As soon as I click the Dataflow option, it starts setting up something in the background to make sure that this Dataflow can work. And hopefully all this works correctly based on my demo I did earlier, because I was playing with it a little bit earlier. So if I click the cancel button to exit my Dataflow, there's a little tiny X in the upper right-hand corner here that I'm going to click cancel on, and that'll let me get out of my Dataflow. I do want to exit. I'll click yes in the little menu that pops up. And what happens is, as soon as I click yes, you'll see that there are now more objects available to us. You'll see that there are two objects here, plus the additional one that I created earlier. So this is the Dataflow that I was just in previously, and you'll notice there's two more objects. So to keep things clean here, I'm just going to hit refresh on the page just very briefly. And when I do so, you'll notice now there's 3 objects. So by clicking the button to create my data flow, you will get 3 other objects, data flows, staging lakehouse, in 2 other items here. I don't really know why these are here yet. I don't really know how to interact with them yet. We'll figure that out in the future, but these always appear whenever I start a data flow, which is interesting.
And make sure do not delete them. So right now they are serving a purpose. They're almost like some config files. We have heard people trying to experiment and trying to remove them. They do play some purpose or role.
Yes.
At this point, it's just best to leave them be. Whatever they're going to do, just let them do that on their own. Don't add to them. Don't edit them. Any content that you want to create or any data you want to add, just manually actually create that artifact.
So now, just to be clear, I want to again show that these new objects that we just created are added. So now I'm going to go back into my data flow by clicking the ellipsis here, and we're going to edit our data flow that we had previously. Click on the ellipsis. We're going to click on edit. This will take me into the data flow that we just created. There's nothing in here right now. They do give you a couple immediate options. You can load from Excel, from SQL Server, or import as CSV or text file. I'm going to skip all these objects because I don't want to import any of these things. Instead, I want to go back to my lakehouse. I'm going to go grab the file that we uploaded in a previous episode.
And I just want to iterate to people here. This is really neat. And the amount of workloads that you guys are probably already dealing with SharePoint and OneDrive, that now we already showed that the OneLake Explorer can be installed on any PC, but now we can grab it directly here.
There are 2 ways to get into the low data experience. You can click the top half of the button here called Get Data, or you can click the More option in the drop-down menu if you click the bottom half of the button. So be aware that the button for Get Data is a 2-part button, a top half and a bottom half. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the More option down here at the bottom, which will then bring me into the data source setting of Power Query. And this is your data flow online. So I'm going to pick the new one here called Lakehouse Beta. This is kind of still probably in the works because it's very new and just recently released. So I'm going to click on the Lakehouse object here. And it's going to ask me to connect to my lake to make sure it knows which lake I'm talking about. So I will sign in with my organizational user. Let's refresh my connection here. I don't need a gateway, and I'm going to use my organizational account. It says I'm already signed in. I'm going to click Next. And what it should do is it should accept my user. And so any of the lake houses or any of the workspaces I have access to will then be shown in my left-hand navigation. So if I don't have access to it, it won't show here. So this is basically giving me permissions based on what my user is allowed to see. Now we are working in the workspace called Learn Fabric, the first object here. We're not using the second one, so we're going to ignore him for now. Open up the folder. We'll notice we have our 2 lake houses. So our staging lake house that we saw earlier, and then our Great Lake, the one that we're actually working out of. We're going to open up the Great Lake. And then from inside here, we have a couple objects. We have our folder that contains our files, and then we have some system tables that we can look at. I'm not going to use the system tables. We're going to go into the folder named Files. This is the files that are living inside my lake. Open those up, and we have our 2 folders, baseball data and our financial data. I'll open up the folder for financials, and there we go. This is the file we're going to go start loading our data from, the financial example CSV. I'll click on that option. It's going to tell me I'm going to load this data from my OneLake. No problem. I'll hit the word create in the bottom right-hand corner. And that will then load this file into Power Query. And again, just to be clear here, I'm using the word Power Query and Dataflows interchangeably here because this is the same UI or the same experience you would see with the UI in Power Query. It's slightly different compared to what you see in desktop, but in general, the functionality is basically the same. So we were able to load our first table. You'll notice here on the right-hand side, we had a number of steps automatically pre-created for us. And now we have our imported CSV file as our last object here. Now I'm going to quickly go through a couple cleaning steps. I'll narrate them through for you, but the idea here is when you create anything in Dataflows, you got to make sure the data is in the right format and has the right data types for each of the columns before you leave. Another key point to note here is whenever you're creating things inside Dataflows and particularly inside your data lake, you need to make sure that all the table column names do not have spaces. Table column names will not let you keep any spaces in here. So whenever you're bringing in data from whatever source, SQL, Oracle, any data source that comes from Dataflows, you have to make sure that there's an underscore or no spaces in the name of the header of those different columns. So just be aware of that. That's a gotcha that Tommy and I got stuck by because we keep trying to do this. I'm like, why does it keep failing? Well, there's a space in the column header name. All right.
There's a few other things too with the data types. And we're still finding them out. Currencies and I believe normal date cannot be pushed out from a data lake Gen2.
So if I Control A, I'll select all the columns. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and then I'm going to go to transform columns and I'll go to a text transform. I'm first going to make sure everything is trimmed. Trimming will take away the white spaces or any spaces at the front or the end of any of the text inside this data set. I can then also right click again and say transform columns and I'll do the clean operation, which takes any special characters out of any text. So if you have a no space character or any special characters, it'll get rid of those as well. So I've cleaned all my columns as well. You'll also notice here my row number 1 is my column headers. So I will now promote my column headers. We'll use the option here to use first row as headers, which will then create all the correct titles of each column instead of using column 1, column 2, column 3. When I did that, when I used promoted headers, you'll notice that another step was immediately changed and added here, which is changed the data type of each column. So Power Query tries to go through each of the column and make its educated guess as to which columns and what data types are going to be used here. Again, this is a flat file, an Excel file. So there is ability here for Power Query to not be able to interpret the data. So a couple things I've noticed when I was working with this data is we also need to adjust all the columns that have numerical values. Now the month number identified as a full integer, so no need to change that there. The month year is also a full integer, no need to change that there. However, all of our units sold, we have a data type here called currency, and that doesn't translate well when we're trying to load things into our lakehouse. So what I'm going to do instead is we can look across the numbers here and we can see there's a decimal here, and there's a couple decimals in other places as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change all the data types of these to be the same. So I'm going to grab columns from units sold all the way to profit, right click. Actually, I won't right click. I'm going to go up to the menu here. Units sold through profit. We'll go up to the transform ribbon and we'll change the data type to be a decimal number. First one in the drop-down list. It's going to ask me, do I want to replace the current step that I'm on for changing the data types to columns? I'll say yes, replace the current step. Now also, Power Query is not super smart. It's pretty smart, but not everything. The columns that had a $ and a dash symbol, that was the designation for $0 or no dollars. Well, a $ and a dash symbol doesn't interpret as a 0. So you'll see here in the discounts column, we get a bunch of errors because we can't load that data. Another challenge we found when bringing data into Dataflows Gen 2 or loading back into the lake is you need to make sure that there are no errors in any of your columns. If there are any errors, it will have problems. So another best practice we like to do here is on those data columns that changed over to number values, because those are the ones that potentially will have problems, I'll grab units sold all the way to profit again. And this time I will right click. We will replace errors. So any error that I see, I will replace it with a value of 0. Now you do need to know how this will affect the data engineering of your data. You could be blanking out values that should be real values. I don't really know. But you have to know your data set really well to be able to do these kind of blanketing data transformations to make sure the data is clean and cleansed for your loading later on downstream. All right, with this, we've completed all of our basic data transformations inside Power Query. We're now going to go over here to the bottom right-hand side, and this is really cool. You can now add a destination as to where you want to load this data to, which we've never had before. This is a feature only of Dataflows Gen 2, and actually it's underneath my face right over there. So let me change my screen here very briefly. You can't see that. Let's try this one here. Hold on. There we go. Let's try this again. How about that? Is that better, Tommy?
It's so much better.
There we go. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can see data destination. This is an option that you can see. This is where we load the data to. This is something only found in Dataflows Gen 2. And that's why we like this Dataflow Gen 2. We have more options of where this data needs to land. So I'm going to click the little plus sign here, and we're going to load from the menu. We're going to load back into our lakehouse. We're going to create a Delta table or a table in the lakehouse that we can use somewhere else. Clicking on Lakehouse. Again, it automatically knows I'm signed in. It gives me the option. I'm going to click Next. And now what will happen is this is a dialog that will come up and it'll ask me, where do I want to put the data? So we have any lakehouse we want, really. So it's going to let me put this in any other lakehouse. Interesting thing here is you could land this data in a different workspace. You could put this data in a different lakehouse from somewhere else. This could get very interesting on how you want to engineer data. So be careful what you do here. And you may want to think about a plan or how you want to move data between workspaces, because now Dataflows can now inject data other places for whatever reason. Might be something your business wants to use.
Yes, and Mike, I really this piece right here is going to open up so much. I think what the BI you guys have been doing out there already, all the transformations and all this skill that you've had in Power Query, unfortunately only existed with the end goal being a Power BI report. But now we can actually be so much more part of the conversation when it comes to storing that data in multiple places now, and higher upstream is really the big story here.
Yeah, and this is what I'm looking at here, what we're doing with this. This is really a lot more of what I would call a data engineering role. We're actually engineering the data and we're putting the data in strategic places for the business to use. This is a new role that we haven't really seen in Power BI before. We've seen a little bit with Dataflows, but this is kind of a new workflow that we're seeing, which is kind of cool. So I opened up the Lakehouse area. We went into the demo fabric, and then we went into our option called the Great Lake. This is where our Lakehouse, where we're doing all of our data engineering. I will rename the table here. So let's just rename our table. Let's just call it financial. And then I'm going to go _01. You'll notice right there, as soon as I put a space, it said, you can't have any spaces. You must use an underscore. So I must use an underscore. So financial 01, that's going to be my table that we're going to use. And I'm doing an 01 just because I may load this multiple times. I may, screw it up and you have to fix it. Whatever. This is my first version of the table, whatever. Okay. We'll click next again. Now we get a different screen. We don't see this one. This is a new screen that we're seeing. And this is where we're actually determining the different data types. So in each column that comes from the data flow, we need to map this to an equivalent data type that is going to be used in the table inside our lake. And so this is basically letting us know these are all the acceptable columns we're going to bring forward, and we're going to load them into our lake. And the green checkbox means that the data is actually in the correct format and details so that it could be loaded. The name is correct and the data type is correct. So these are two important things to note. If you have any issues with a data type or an incorrect naming schema, that checkbox will not be checked, and there'll be a little warning symbol next to it telling you, hey, this column can't be moved over. We can't use this new column in the new data source.
And this is really important too, as you go through this, making sure you do it right the first time. Microsoft does not show you errors right now in the data transformation. So the only thing that happens is you're just going back and forth
Get a failure,
having to load up.
Yeah, you don't know what's going on. So I would say the error messaging could be a little bit to be desired. All right, we'll hit save on this one. And assuming we did everything correctly here, we hit save on that. So that's going to go there to our lakehouse. The only other option here now, again, this is tricky. Previously, when we clicked new data flow, the name of the data flow was unable to be changed. It called it Dataflow 01 or Dataflow 1 and just landed in the lake, or in our workspace, I'm sorry. Now you'll notice that I've come back into the Dataflow a second time. You can click the down arrow next to the word Dataflow, and now I can officially rename my Dataflow. So here I can go in here, and now I can rename this one to load financial data. I'm going to make it very descriptive because that way we know what's going on from file, because we'll probably do more of these in the future. So I have to hit enter now, which will then officially rename this data flow. And now that I'm officially complete, I've changed my name, I've got my data types right. I may even want to rename the table. We can do that later. I'll click the word publish. And another option here that you'll notice here, you have the option to publish it now or publish it later. So you can just save your changes and walk away and come back later. So I think that's what that really means in that publish later. But for now, I'm okay with it. I'm going to publish it as is. So I'm going to click the word publish. Now, assuming I did everything correctly here, you'll notice that the data flow with its proper name now shows up. there's going to be a little spinning wheel here. What it's going to do is first going to try to publish the data flow. And then after the data flow is published, knowing that there is a destination for the data, you'll see that the refreshing option will then light up right after. So first it will publish the data flow, and then secondarily, it will then try to refresh it, and that will then move the data into our lake information. So with this, looks like it just finished the publishing the data flow. That's done. And now you can see over here, just like I said, the refreshing cycle is now occurring. So now it's going to actually process the data and try and bring it into the lake. I do want to take a moment here, and Tommy and I were also debating about this. We're thinking about, okay, we loaded a file from the lake, did some transformations to it, and put the file back in the lake. Well, we didn't really put the file back. What you'll see here is when we go back to the lake house, a table will be created. So we went basically from a file, clean data, table, and now we're going to have a table complete. Now, we did this with a simple file. One of the workflows we think this could replace would be loading data from SharePoint. So if you have a lot of SharePoint files or files that come from SharePoint, this might be an opportunity for you to not use SharePoint anymore and instead bring those files directly to the lake, load those files there, and then load them using a data flow. I will also point out, and Tommy made a great point around this one when we were talking earlier, this is not just around data flows. You can actually use, the data flow will actually give you the flexibility to do anything you want here, right? Tommy, what are some common data sources that you like to connect to and how you'd use data flows?
Yeah, so obviously the big ones are just taking files from SharePoint or OneDrive and trying to automate, but been doing a lot with APIs and just trying to actually store that data. And that's always been the hardest thing with Power BI is, okay, well, we have the data right now, but it's 4 weeks or it's getting sampled. I always wish that we had the ability, just like in your old SQL job days, to just do one day at a time and just hold that data in. And even incremental refresh, fine, but it wasn't stored anywhere. It wasn't actually historical. If you lost the file, everything was gone. But now we can actually pull from APIs. So for all you marketing people out there, there's a lot of data for you now to actually store and hold in a lakehouse. SQL is another good one, just to clean up the data too. That's a huge other part of this too, is just transforming everything so it adheres to what really BI and everyone's working on.
Yeah, so some of my common sources are, to your point, I use SQL. Typically, if I'm using APIs, I'm using a different thing. I don't usually like to do APIs through Power BI data flows. It just seems to be a bit too slow for me. So typically, if I'm using APIs, I'm doing them through like a pipeline or something a bit more robust that gives me more capability in the API calling. Other sources that I really like using from the different sources here, the OData is another great. It's kind of like an API, but it's producing tables as opposed to an API piece. And then I'm using a lot of other things inside the Power BI ecosystem. So I may be pulling data from Dataverse, or I may be pulling data from other objects or assets that are created inside the Power BI ecosystem. Okay.
And that's another really good point, because there's a big part here that really just can't be underestimated. You have the full ability, basically, of Power Query, everything that you've already been doing now really much farther upstream. And it's such a game changer.
We can now see that our data flow has now finally refreshed. It it had landed the data, no errors at this point in time. So we're feeling good about it. Now what we need to go check out is, where does the data live? We pulled it out of the lakehouse, we did some engineering to it, and we went back to the lakehouse. So let's go back into our Great Lake. And if we go back into the Great Lake, we should now see, a weird table called unidentified. This is something that has also caught people. Maybe this will happen in the future, but for whatever reason, when you come back to the lakehouse, even though that table was there, it loaded the data from the data flow, it brought it back to my lake as a Delta table, but it doesn't define it yet. I actually have to go in here and click this refresh button in the upper right-hand corner. So when I click refresh, it will then go grab the definition of that newly created table and load it into my lake. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna click the refresh button. It will then go look at the information about that table, and boom. Now we have a financial table, and when I click on the name financial table, you'll see that it will read the data and then present the data for me in my form in here in the window. You'll also notice if I open up the table, you can see all the individual files that go along with it. They're the columns. These are all the columns and their data types. And if you click on the ellipsis here, you can actually view the files that make up this table. So if I click on view files, these are the Parquet. This is the Delta format that's being used under the hood to support this table. So this is what's actually being used to define this information for me. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to manage it. All I have to do is worry about refreshing my data flow, and this will bring the data into this table every single time from that same file. All right. With that, we have done a full load, a flat table, all the way into a file, loading directly into a data flow. Any final thoughts, Tommy?
Mike, I am so excited. If nothing else from all of this is just diving into more of the use cases of what people are going to do with data flows and be able to push that out.
Yeah, we're just scratching the surface here. We're just getting some data. We're just trying to load the lake with some information. We haven't even touched data sets. At this point, we've only done things in Fabric. There's been nothing about this that's actually Power BI centric yet. So we'll get there. We're building more tables. Once we get a little bit more information here, we'll start go ahead building data sets and reports eventually with Power BI as well. Awesome. Well, with that, thank you all very much. We appreciate your time, and we'll see you next time.